Heads up, this episode talks about depression, anxiety, and a suicide attempt. Please listen with care. If you need support, we've got resources listed in our show notes.
Hello.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Kind of nervous. I wrote a few things down because I get nervous and forget.
No, that's great. I appreciate you doing that prep.
My name is Aswani. My pronouns are she, her. And I've been actually having a really good day. I made some new friends today. We went out for lunch.
So I know you've already talked to some of my colleagues. This is a collaboration with the University of Toronto's Investigative Journalism Bureau. They published Generation Distress like a few years ago now. Do you remember reading it or like seeing it? And do you have any feelings about it?
I think it's really stressful for a lot of young people right now. It already was, but definitely COVID made things a lot worse. People are feeling so isolated. As long as I can remember, I've had depression and anxiety, but I haven't been able to articulate it or understand why my body is acting the way it is. And it's really easy to feel like, oh, I'm the only one that's feeling this way.
So that piece actually made you feel less alone.
Yeah.
This is In Our Heads, a podcast about generation distress. My name is Tiffany Lam. My pronouns are they and she. The first time I met Aswani Siwakoti, I'll be honest, I was surprised when she told me that this bleak online series, the one I'd been tasked to help adapt into this podcast, gave her a sense of companionship.
So it's nice to have things out there that we can read or watch that let us know that we're not acting abnormally or anything.
Aswani is 25 years old now, but she was in third year when she signed up to be an interview subject in the Investigative Journalism Bureau's online series. The IJB called it Generation Distress. Aswani wasn't named then, but she's agreed to be named now. She got her BA in psychology from the University of Toronto during the pandemic. These days, art plays a big role in her mental health.
I've made more time for art, which is something that I really liked growing up, and then I had left because life gets busy. I purposely carve out time to make art, take care of my plants. So engaging in activities that will lift me up. Purely just medication will not help you.
But while she was at U of T, she was one of the 152 students who answered the Investigative Journalism Bureau's call. The IJB's team of reporters was looking for youth who self-identified with having mental health struggles. You might remember the print series in the Toronto Star or maybe the National Observer. The investigation was a collaboration between media organizations in Canada and the US, as well as 10 universities.
Something is happening inside the minds of our young people. 1 in 5 Canadian youth are part of a mental health crisis that is undermining and far too often ending their lives.
That's Rob Cribb in a Toronto Star video. We sat down with him 2 years after his organization first published the series.
Feels weird to be this close to the mic.
You don't have to have your eyebrows touching the pop filter if you don't want to.
My name is Robert Cribb. I'm an investigative journalist at the Toronto Star, and I'm director and founder of the Investigative Journalism Bureau at the University of Toronto.
Rob has a bit of a reputation of being a capital S, capital J serious journalist. So I'll admit, I was surprised he was somewhat vulnerable about the way this series came about.
This is, it's one of those investigations that really starts with a personal story. My daughter was struggling with mental health issues a few years ago, and it brought me into this kind of world of mental health services for young people, which of course I knew nothing about at the time, but in the process of trying to help her, I learned a lot about how the system works and how it doesn't work.
Sometimes I do think it works out for journalists to cover something personal, even if there's a traditional school of thought of journalism that says otherwise.
What struck me at some point on that journey was that this wasn't really a story about my daughter, right? This was so pervasive. And I sort of started reading. I do what journalists do in these circumstances. So I dug in and did a ton of research to try and figure out kind of where do I go and what are the best practices and what are the scenarios that are going to fit her. And in the process of doing that, you're basically kind of doing journalistic research, right? And the data was so striking and overwhelming, unprecedented levels of suicidality, anxiety, depression in young people that nobody had ever seen before.
The IJB series published 10 stories over the course of 2020, 2021 in the Toronto Star. The pieces touched on topics including the struggle that schools are facing to keep up with demand for mental health support, the solutions that have been put forward to meet this demand, the rise in antidepressant use among youth today, and the potential for digital solutions for better or worse. These are the areas where there have been developments since this once-in-a-lifetime pandemic traumatized us all. And so, over the course of this series, we'll get into those 4 chapters in particular. But first, why dub this generation coming of age Generation Distress at all? When the IJB spoke with students who identified as struggling with their mental health, here's what the 152 students said. 90% said they had anxiety. 80% said they were living with depression. 62% said they had thought of quitting school. And almost half had contemplated suicide.
Data is frustrating because data simply says, here's what is. It offers no insights into the real questions, right, which are the how and the why. At the end of the day, there's lots of theories. There is a greater defense and protection of kids today by parents, generally speaking, I think. And I'm no expert on parenting, believe me, but that's certainly one that we heard a lot. The rewiring of the young brain, in ways that humans have never been rewired as a result of instant communication and the internet and social media. Expectations are created a million times a day, all of these factors.
Experts that the IJB interviewed also named existential angst as a source of distress.
There is much we don't know about what climate change might mean for us here in Ontario. What we do know, however, is that it will cost us.
As interest rates cranked up last year with 7 hikes by the Bank of Canada in 2022 alone, it could be hard to figure out whether that or inflation was worse for your bottom line.
Ontario's housing programs will not keep pace with demand.
The world has just observed the 1-year anniversary of Russia's illegal attack on Ukraine.
An uptick in violent and often random attacks on Toronto's transit system put the TTC and the city on alert that more needs to be done to ensure public safety.
And I'll never forget a ProPublica piece that said that parts of the U.S. are on track to become too hot and too humid, that human bodies who live there won't be able to cool themselves quickly enough anymore. Meaning, parts of Canada might be one of the few places on the continent that will have suitable living conditions for humans by 2070 if we're lucky, 2040 if we're unlucky. Jean Tai, a psychotherapist who's worked with post-secondary students, said that among people who came to her, there was a broader feeling that the world was falling apart. She also named a sense of disconnection, feeling othered or concern about job prospects. She said students often felt not blank enough, smart enough, social enough, you fill in the blank. For Rob, there isn't one clear cause for these startling statistics that him and his team found.
My theory is that there is no one answer. It's all of these things. It's like everything in life. It's way more complicated than I think we can ever imagine. We talk to the smartest people in the world on this stuff. There is disagreement. At the end of the day, I think what I come away with is whatever that mix of things is, and to whatever extent one is more important than the other, it is real.
Where do you think the mental health crisis stands 2 years after your investigation has ended?
Well, I don't think it'll ever end. I feel like we're going to be doing this, for a very long time. The data continues to show similar trending. You can't just, with a stroke of the pen, solve this problem. It's not like a legislative change is going to solve this problem. This is a generational problem.
I wonder, what age is adolescence and what age is youth, just to start with terms?
It's an excellent question. It's always the question. I'm also a researcher. We're always having this question of what is adolescence? How do we define youth?
It's a question I'm sure we're all preoccupied with. My echo chamber constantly tells me that 30 is the new 20.
My name is Dr. Amy Gajeria. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. I'm also an assistant professor and the equity lead for the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Toronto. My pronouns are she and her. There's a lot of different definitions out there. I commonly think of it as 12 to 24, 12 to 25.
That's youth?
Youth.
Okay.
Yeah. That's kind of based on a couple of definitions, UN definitions, UNICEF. Some people will define adolescence as anything that ends in teen, so, 14 to 19. But we do know that the brain develops until 25. And there's been a lot of shifting demographics, especially in the last 30, 40 years, in terms of how we actually define what is adolescence, what is youth. But then also the demands that are there for that period of time. It's not as clearly defined for us. It's also not clearly defined for young people. And the expectations of when you're supposed to achieve something, when you're supposed to achieve certain milestones, who helps you with that, also can feel fuzzy to young people, just like it does to those of us that are trying to define it.
If 30 really is the new 20, that also means 20-year-old anxieties from generations past linger for longer now. And the longer people are exposed to stressors, the greater the risk for developing a mental illness. Think ruminating on how to ever buy a home, how to find a life partner. For the purposes of this series, I think it's important to articulate that youthfulness in the mental health context extends past the legal adult age of 18, not only because socially, the implication of youthfulness and maturity can shape what you stress about. Why am I still living at home with my parents? Why can't I find a full-time job with benefits? Am I on track? But also, biologically, humans are still youthful when they are legal adults, and that has a big impact on mental health. A person is more likely to develop their lifelong mental illness when they are young. Here's Dr. Gajeria again.
The majority of mental health conditions, mental illnesses, will develop in those 14, 15, 16 years up until 25.
A neuroscientist at Carleton told us there are certain things that are physically undeniable about the youthful human brain.
I would say the big difference is that children, teenagers, and even young adults don't have a lot of the same hardware as that the adult does, which specifically relates to the very front part of your brain, your frontal lobe. My name is Dr. Kim Hellmans. My pronouns are she, her, and elle. At Carleton, I'm appointed in the Department of Neuroscience. I'm an assistant professor.
Dr. Hellmans says that the frontal lobe has many purposes.
One thing that it does do is it kind of helps to shut down these stress responses and to regulate the emotions, right? So this is why when you see in kids that are really upset, tantrums, as a good example, have a hard time shutting that down, right? And if you ever seen a 2-year-old or a 5-year-old or even an 11-year-old, like my daughter this morning, crying and you're saying, stop crying, they actually can't. They physically lack that hardware to be able to control their emotions.
Brain science still doesn't fully understand why lifelong illnesses in the brain develops then. They suspect it's development-related or hormone-related. But Dr. Gajeria does have a clear line on when anguish becomes an illness in her field.
We all have normal sadness, we have normal anxiety. When it gets to be an illness, it's because it interferes with your ability to function or it causes significant distress. That's the definition that we would use.
I wanted to ask you where you think some of your anxiety and depression stems from. Do you have a sense?
Probably childhood trauma. I'm from Nepal. I came to Canada when I was 6 or 7, and there was a very big difference between how my friends were growing up and the experiences they experienced and what I was going through at home. So I think I always felt like an outsider. and then everything just perpetuated itself. Anytime I would feel overwhelmed or anything, or worried about what if this, what if that, I'd be told, why are you so negative? Don't do that. Don't think like that. And I was like a little kid. I didn't know. So I really didn't have that many people to talk to, I felt like. My mom was always working, so I didn't really have her in my life until I was in my teenage years. I just didn't know how to express myself. And then when I did, I felt like I was doing it wrong.
Yeah.
It felt like I was the only one in the world feeling like that.
If it were me, I wouldn't want to ever be negative around them again. And that is not really the way.
Yeah, and especially when you're an immigrant family, I felt like I always had to be grateful.
Yes.
And sometimes I wasn't. And that made me feel a lot of guilt and just a lot of negative emotions that I didn't know how to process. Like, I do appreciate everything my parents have done for me, but sometimes I feel like they forgot that I was also being a support system to them.
Interesting.
I didn't really get to communicate that to my mom when I was younger.
Yeah.
We're really close.
Yeah.
She's like my best friend. But I was an emotional support for her for a lot of my childhood.
Like how?
Well, my parents had a messy marriage, and I was the one who she talked to all the time about things maybe you shouldn't talk to your children about. And I think that's very common in immigrant family dynamics.
A medically reviewed blog post on verywellmind.com tells me moving is in the top 5 most stressful life events. Studies have shown that moving, and therefore by extension immigrating, migrating, and displacement can cause trauma. Trauma is defined as challenging emotional consequences that living through a distressing event can have for an individual. That's according to the Center of Addiction and Mental Health. CAMH offers a caveat that traumatic events are hard to define, and the same event can cause more trauma in some compared with others. Dr. Hellman said trauma was prevalent among her students, and if the brain registers a distressing event, there is an emotional, mental, and even physical impact.
We see about 30% of students have experienced a significant trauma in their lifetime, which can be things from having a parent with a significant psychiatric disorder, car accidents, natural disasters. These things are all considered traumatic events. And the work that I've done, looking at how trauma rewires the brain, lots of work from other colleagues across the globe show that trauma does change the brain in very significant ways. It changes the body. Folks that have experienced highly traumatic events have a heightened stress response, right? Their fear and stress levels are higher. They're more sensitive to stressors. And then their circuits that are involved in reward and pleasure are dampened, sort of tuned down. So we have heightened stress and lower reward.
As I've put this show together with my team, one question we've often come back to is who the show is for. At first, I thought I'd be happy with anyone who wanted to learn about youth mental health with an open mind. But if I'm being honest, I think I want this to be for my immigrant family. Like people who ignore their emotions because they think it's unproductive, or people who are skeptical of softness and hardened by trauma, generational and otherwise. If nothing else, I want this show to give listeners the language and the information about the risks of poor mental health, what it sounds like and what it can feel like, how our systems fail to nurture good mental health sometimes, and actually fail some of us more than others. For instance, Dr. Kajaria can name a distressing difference when it comes to the access racialized Canadians have to mental health support compared with their white counterparts. Brace yourself.
It's definitely worse, and it tends to be through the emergency room.
Oh, interesting. Wow. I can definitely picture people I love letting mental health go by the wayside until way too late. Canadian Chinese author Lindsay Wong has a whole memoir called The Woo Woo about what that does to her family.
Again, it can vary by community. It can vary by like what population you're talking about. What we tend to see, I think we've seen this data for a number of immigrant communities. We certainly have this data for people who identify as Black and Indigenous, that people's pathway into the system tends to be through the emergency room and sometimes brought by police.
And so already in crisis.
Already in crisis, high acuity, but also not voluntary and also very traumatic, or through the forensic system. So someone might be so unwell that they become involved with the law, they're found not criminally responsible, and then that's their access to mental health. And that disparity is huge.
Jacqueline Carr was another youth the Investigative Journalism Bureau got in touch with.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline, she, they. I'm from here, from Hiawatha, from Mississauga of Rice Lake. On the end of my spirit name, it says Kwe, but I identify as a two-spirited Indigenous person.
They felt good about how their story turned out.
I liked how it all kind of came together into one piece because we would only hear about other people's stories and interviews, but I liked having it all come together.
The piece that Jacqueline was in, you hear from both her and her mom, Chief Lori Carr from Hiawatha First Nation.
My Indigenous name is Eagle Woman. I really enjoyed it, and it did capture our truth.
Jacqueline was diagnosed with clinical depression and anxiety when she was in college. She says she was about 17, 18 years old.
But it's like I've lived with it since I was a kid. I think I started changing a lot more when I think I was 11.
11.
I think that's when it got really bad. I think that's when I couldn't go to school. Like I would have panic attacks and I had to be forced to go to school. That's when my grandmother died. That was the year my grandmother died. So it kind of just hit you like a ton of bricks. I didn't really understand it, but I was always sad or I was angry. And I was always angry at her.
Jacqueline's looking at her mother there. The IJB piece is about how drumming helped Jacqueline connect with purpose. And since Jacqueline last spoke with the IJB team 2 years ago, they've become a knowledge keeper in their community.
When I got the email, I'm like, a knowledge keeper? I was like, no way. Like, I was just like shocked and then I'm like, I couldn't have got this far already.
How does it make you feel seeing her take this path?
Oh my goodness, so grateful. You know, when I saw my daughter at the bottom and to see her come back again through this path of learning her culture and her traditions and knowing that that's what's helping to save her. I am, well, proud and honored and definitely grateful that, you know, she's doing this. She works hard.
That moment Lori's referring to, seeing Jacqueline at the bottom, Lori's talking about witnessing Jacqueline trying to hurt herself. And a warning to listeners, the next story contains details about a suicide attempt. So skip ahead, about 2 minutes, if that's something you can do without right now. You'll know it's over because the music will be over.
I was actually at my son's house. He was on his honeymoon, and I was watching his my 2 grandsons.
I don't know how I did it, but I messaged the last person, and that person was my friend Jasmine. That's the girl I left.
It was her friend Jasmine that called me. She said, Jacqueline's going to hurt herself.
I messaged her one thing, and I said, call an ambulance. So there was something inside of me wanting to stay.
And so I hung up. I called my husband. I said, where's Jacqueline?
I remember looking around my house, and it was not my house anymore. I felt like maybe I was in the in-between.
And I said, okay, you go check on her. Jasmine just told me this.
I kind of felt disassociated from my body. I just knew.
He come back to the phone and told me to get home.
And I just knew what I was going to do. I just knew that was it. So I just did it without really a second thought.
And I went home and washed, wrapped her arms up. And then we just laid with her on our bed. That was the first time I understood. I used to think of those commercials where they say, depression hurts. I saw it that night, where she was crying and shaking. I saw the pain. I literally saw the pain.
I can't thank them enough for sharing their story, especially because Jacqueline is not alone. Brace yourself for more distressing statistics here. When the Investigative Journalism Bureau commissioned a global trend tracker firm called Real-Time Interactive Worldwide Intelligence to survey 6,000 students across the U.S. and Canada, they found that more than a third of Indigenous respondents reported living with depression, but only a quarter of all respondents said the same. And between 2011 and 2016, the suicide rates for Indigenous people under 25 was 6 times higher than non-Indigenous Canadians. It was 11.5 times higher for Indigenous young women. I wonder, what goes through your head, Jacqueline, when you hear a stat like that?
I kind of just thought I'm really a part of that statistic. Really, it's kind of sad. You go, I can't.
I think many, many feelings come to mind. Sad, definitely. Not surprised, which then goes back to that piece of feeling sad. We're all connected. You don't just feel for an individual, you also feel for the family, the community, the nation that they're from when you hear these things. And, to know that our women, our children, our men are treated so disrespectfully and as less than, that they get to a point where they feel that they need to end their own lives to get from that pain. It's just so hard to understand.
Confusion feels like an apt reaction. How do we get to people feeling so neglected and isolated that escape, in any of its forms really, feels like the only option? Jacqueline named one thing that they felt was key to their returning to a better headspace.
A lot of our youth struggle to find their culture, their roots, and I think it's important to help re-earth them and let them grow. I've never felt like I belonged here until I touched my drum, until I sang, until I was learning the teachings, until I was speaking the language. When I sing, it feels like I am a part of something bigger. I feel that importance, feel that purpose. And I think that's a lot of what our youth are missing, is that purpose.
When Jacqueline tells me about finding purpose and feeling like she belongs, I'm reminded of what Dr. Hellman said about trauma's impacts on reward and pleasure. I'm relieved and encouraged that despite their trauma, Jacqueline's connecting with their culture and traditions helped overcome that dampened sense of reward.
When I look back and think, if you look at progress instead of trauma, instead of like different blocks in your life, but you look at progress, I'm like, yeah, I did make a lot of progress to get here, and I was so grateful to be recognized for my community.
Aswani from the top of the episode also seems to show new growth and self-awareness.
I just have switched in the way I think. I try to put myself in situations that do make me nervous, because I find that with practice, things get easier. So now when things make me nervous, like doing this podcast, those are symptoms of my anxiety. So I approach them differently. Whereas before I would be like, oh no, I'm dying.
Right.
I have health issues, or just catastrophizing everything. Going from, I don't know what the heck is happening, to being able to comfortably speak on how I feel. And it's helped me make a community. And it's helped me connect with a lot more people, because I know now that I'm not the only one feeling anxious or sad.
Next time, we'll look at the role schools play in youth mental health and whether universities are putting enough money into addressing the issue.
Based off of the research that I collected and based off my own personal experiences as a student, it is not enough. The one thing that they won't invest in is their students.
We'll also look at how to balance mental health and academic rigor.
The challenge I see is that a lot of students try to delay the stress. We need to learn to face these, tackle them, overcome them, because that builds our resilience.
And if students are feeling unsupported at school, what can universities do about it? Thanks for listening. I know it can be tough to take in, so if you're feeling like you need help, know that you can always call 1-866-585-0445 or text wellness to 686868 for youth or 741-741 for adults. We'll also list some resources in our show notes. In Our Heads is hosted and written by me, Tiff Lam, and co-produced with Matthew O'Mara. Matthew and I also reported and edited the show. This show also relies on reporting from Generation Distress, an Investigative Journalism Bureau series published in the Toronto Star. The team was led by Robert Cribb, Declan Keogh, Julia Fione, and Charlie Buckley. This episode got production support from Nikki Ashworth and Jonathan Hallowell. Shahriar Tajvidi is managing editor of podcasts and digital video. Lori Few is executive producer digital at TVO, and John Ferry is VP of Programming and Content. Thanks again for listening.